Hi, my name is Benedict. This is a kind of a mixed walkthrough, but it's also a sort of a composition. It's an all-rounder thing. I see music making as a holistic process, not about any particular slice of it. While I am a firm believer in the Henry Ford approach to making music, not creating pointless production lines where everything is separated, but the idea of using specialists to focus on tasks that they are stronger at than not, as in it makes sense to hire Eddie Van Halen to play your guitar and to hire Bill Bruford to play your drums, far more than it makes sense to have me try and do both. Because believe me, I can't play guitar or drums, therefore, if I've got access to better people, I'd be mad not to use them. But otherwise, I see music as very much being a holistic process. This is the way I was brought up. This is the way that rock and roll used to be made. The trouble is now that since the whole EDM and DAW revolution, we've created this whole mindset of everything has to be exact. Everything has to be on the grid. Not just time, but tuning, but also the very sounds and the very decisions we make have to be these pre-approved, do you want it there or there? If you don't want it either of those, then you need to stop. And that's really messed up. My big thing to encompass that holistic idea is story. Where does story come from? Now, I've said this quite a lot of times, and I'll say it again. As far as I'm concerned, it comes from the song gods. Do they exist? No, not really. But the idea that I am 159.375% in control of absolutely everything I do when making music is, well, it's a bit mental. It's arrogant, and that's not the wisest thing. Music and arrogance, while people think, oh, well, rock stars are all arrogant, yeah, some of them are. Some of them are right dicks, but they tend not to last in the business, unless they are truly exceptional, but even there, they're probably not as arrogant as people try to make out. I recently saw a comment on a very famous female singer, who happens to actually teach in my area. Now, I have not met the lady, I kind of wish I had, but I've heard her enough on enough records to go, she knows what she's doing. And somebody was bitching that that this person had no idea how to teach, that this woman was just mean. Now, what that tells me is maybe it's true, but maybe that person just didn't like being told what they needed to do to progress from being, well, not particularly good, to good or exceptional. There's a big difference there between saying, I'll do the formula thing, and being exceptional. I try to encourage people to do that. The song gods are about learning to be exceptional because we take it outside of ourselves. So the question that keeps coming up, particularly from a friend of mine who really struggles to get this because he's been ingrained in that whole everything's on the grid, everything is by some formula, and that if you get the formulas right, then magically it's happening. And he's always going, well, where do you get your stories from? How do you get them? How do you express them in this weird sort of, how's that story? You know, it doesn't say anything about waking up in the morning and combing your hair and rushing downstairs to catch the bus. No, it does not. It's a feeling thing, and you just have to get there. Hence, the song gods. Now, I'm just finished a piece. Whether this is how the piece is going to stay, I don't know. I've given it a name. Working through the piece, I didn't really have a name for it until the point came where I was like, it has to be better than document one. And therefore, I gave it a name, and I looked at it and I said, well, what's this really been saying? What have I been working towards? What have the song gods been leading me towards the whole time that I have worked on this? And it happened fairly quickly. I started on it last night with mostly just making the sound, the first sound, and then today filled the whole thing out. Made a few changes because I felt like I was being lazy, which I was, and it was stopping me from achieving what ultimately became the title. The title is, as you can see in the top left, True Beauty Goes On, along with Celine's Heart. Now, this is not an isolated idea. It's part of a record. The record that I'm making is working under one of the song titles, which is The Eternal Eternity of Mechanism. It's a pretty big title. Now, not trying to be fancy pants or anything, I'm a little poetic. And the thing here is that the concept for this record is about man's interaction with mechanization. We can look simplistically, the man-machine relationship. Man meets robot. Man loses his job. Robot doesn't care. That's one approach. The other is what I'm talking about, the grid. In terms of music, all our music has stopped being a holistic process. It's been about following the grid. And so that's where the idea has come from. It's various bits and pieces that come in. Now, one of the things that influenced what I did today was my partner Jane wanted to watch Tron Legacy, the second one. Good excuse to eat corn chips. So that's affected some of what I did, some of the decisions that I have made, and some of the decisions were made because I absolutely did not want to end up with my piece being similar to what I heard in that movie. And I know some of you will cry foul, but as far as I'm concerned, while the synth bits, I don't call them music, sound great. They really do, like sonically, oh. But in terms of music, they don't go anywhere. They're often like a couple of bars just looped over and over again. But they're incidental music, so fair enough. But like most of that movie, I think that it's about form over function. And I don't want my music to be that way because I don't have the luxury of that kind of, here we can just baffle them with money and our steamroller. I need to actually get and keep my fans based upon the content that I give them, the places that I take them, the stories that I tell them. So the record is largely mechanized to some extent. There's this constant struggle within the pieces between a mechanized feel and a far more open feel. So here's one that I prepared earlier, actually finished it yesterday, and there had been some discussion of Metallica. So that actually ends up, not deliberately, but being reflected in the title. So there's a lot of feel in the record of this mechanization with some direct sequencing and with some sounds which are designed to sound somewhat like machines. I started and made this sound, which is obviously very, very electronic, but there's a fair amount of work in there that tries to move us away from the usual suspects of getting it exactly so. It actually induces a whole lot of resonances, which part of me was like, maybe I should try and get rid of them in the mix. But the more successful I was at getting rid of them, the less the sound actually shone in the way that it needs to shine. This is the nature of story. It's more important that this sound sparkles and constantly glitters than it is for it to have no bad resonances, because everything about this sound is actually lots and lots of resonances. So I had this section yesterday. And that came as I was making the sound and was like, okay, that's interesting. Opened up today thinking, well, okay, what do I want to experiment with today? And playing with resonances yesterday, I wanted to try a different approach. Now, the device, I thought, that might do that. It sort of does, but it kind of didn't give me anything magical. Now, the Song Gods led me somewhere that worked, but part of my ego was trying to go somewhere else to play around or what have you. But I ended up with this. And again, that line just suggested itself to me. I just start playing it. Slight problem is that it's not really in the key in which I was working. But I liked how this sounded to start with. So the solution that just came to me was like, well, just change key. It's between C and G, and they're pretty darned compatible. There's just one sharp in difference. So I just transitioned. Now, while in many ways most people aren't going to hear that, you just feel that sort of slight shift because where notes have been all the wet keys, now suddenly there's a non-white key. Apparently can't say the word blick. There's a sharp in there instead. That changes the feel. So we've got this slight sideways move, which I like doing in my music, and I think works really well here, in the sense that there is repetition here, but there's new material. Rather than this second line cloning the first line, there's a similarity, but they work around each other. There's a conflict. Very pleased with that. But I know that we need to go somewhere else next. So this is where we end up going. The drum was the very last thing made. I knew I was going to want it. I could just hear straight away in my head, it's like, well, okay, what we want is this interesting bass sound with a drum backing it. Not anything more than there's two basically becoming one. And then I added this little pulsy line. And that's using an M seg, so the note doesn't play at the beginning. Well, it plays, but we don't really hear it. And then it's just like a square wave opening and closing the it's a kind of filtering thing going on inside there. And we get this cool kind of moving thing. So that reminds us of the mechanism that runs through the record. Along with the big heavy bass and drum and this mechanization, it's gone from this sort of beautiful thing into this stentorian, rigid kind of thing. It's reminding us that there is machinery in here, that there's mechanization constantly, but it stays beautiful in its own way. Then the next section, actually bring in this melody again. Initially, it was literally the same as this. They were the same. And it sounded great. It really did. It sounded great. But the problem was there was no individuality in it. It didn't move anywhere, so I had to move it somewhere. If the story is of creating beauty, it has to create some contrast with itself, rather than just, well, we're going to play the same thing over and over again. That's cool if we want to just show nothing but mechanization, but the record's not about nothing but mechanization, because that's pointless. We are the robots, And if we do nothing but that, Kraftwerk didn't do nothing but that. They constantly counterpointed between the coolness of mechanization and the humanity that had to sit alongside it. Otherwise, the record was pointless. Kraftwerk did it beautifully, often with quite minimal material. So I've taken the same timing of notes, but I've moved them out, so we've got a little bit of a sense of harmony. We're starting an octave up, this one goes down, this one goes down, they stayed the same, but then we go to a harmony. So that creates a sense of, oh yeah, that's going to be the same, it sounds lovely. Oh, hello. Again, there's this sense of going somewhere different that comes with all of that. As it goes into the next part, we're taken over by this sound, which up high is pretty thin, but when played properly, is actually enormous. So we've got a combination of some sort of human voice type feel. There's this little twitter, and that's very kind of rigid. It's not perfectly rigid, but there's a square wave inside there, along with something or other else. So we've got the rigidity of the square wave, a little bit of movement. It builds a kind of a tension and a beauty at the same time. So there's something mechanical and something beautiful in the sound. But it comes in really high, so we don't hear the voice part. And where these two, remember, we're exactly the same rhythm, this one now is more complex. So you can see that we've added more complexity, and that's the idea of becoming more beautiful. Because beauty is, to some extent, complexity, even though it can be expressed in real minimal forms. Bach was a master of giving him 2 notes, and he could somehow create this sort of huge, rich feel. Then bring it all kind of together. This gets to express its lower form. The drum simplifies, it just goes to the root note, and then ultimately we return to the C rather than the G. So the piece begins in C major, moves to G, and then goes back to C major here. Again, the only difference is one sharp, but it changes the feel as we move across. Again, it's just about how these parts move around each other. All I'm wanting to do, the more I work with this, the more I want to express that feeling of, yes, the big solid bass and drum, which don't move around a lot, and then their little companion in this bass line, which drops. A lot of its detail. Remember, it started really kind of bright here. So it moves back out of the way. Rather than trying to always poke our eye at, it pulls itself back, which means that the emphasis ends up being on these other sounds. The drum has also changed a little by here. In this section, rather than it matching that bass line, it's now moved out on its own and carries a heartbeat-ish kind of feel. So it reminds us that we are machines as well, and that we don't have to be at odds with each other. We are needing to work with our machine, what we've got. That's the story. As to, but how did you come up with that? It's like, I let it come to me. I let the story tell itself. Simply because we're always thinking about stuff. If we sit down and try to make our story too logical, we can do that. And that's called a concept album. And I've done it a few times. This is a themed album, not a concept album. So I'm not having to say, look, at bar 43, I need to work with exactly that. That's film composing. And I enjoy it. I've done it, won awards for it. But we can be a lot looser. So it's the overall feel that creates the story. In terms of mixing, well, it looks pretty usual for me. I've taken the drum and bass, put them into a rhythm bus, and then let everything else sit as it will. A little bit of panning, no hard panning. Everything, each one of these sounds is quite stereo. I did have to fix an issue. To start with, the pulsette is stereo. Sounds great, but once we got into this next section, because this is out here a little bit, can't have everything in the middle, just everything wide, wide, wide. We've got to have some movement. There's not a lot, but there is a little bit of between these couple of sounds being left and right. So I pull the pulsate down a little bit because its role now is not to lead, but to hold the center. The listener's never going to hear this, but if I leave it out wide, it no longer finds a place in the mix. Otherwise, it becomes a bit pointless. It's lost. So part of the story is that we do have this little beep, 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 beep thing going through, and we need to keep that as appropriate. Yes, its high end gets removed through time. As we see, we fade that back with the filter, but we also need to narrow it so that it's not fighting with the more important melodic elements. That's the bulk of that. The usual going into a reverb. The reverb is big. It goes on, it goes on. So that was there right from the beginning. It was part of building this sound. I pulled it back a little bit because it needed to work with other elements of the mix, but nonetheless this great big huge sound. So I had to work out how to manage that. Initially it was incredibly bright, but then it became impossible to work with other instruments. It pulled up the sparklies of this, but it created a lot of problems for every other instrument. And in reality, it wasn't so good. So took that sound and still kept it bright, but turned up the dampening of it. So the high frequency damp meant that the reverb stayed, but it lost a lot of its treble as it went by. The EQ there is pulling out a fair amount of the low end, but giving us a little bit of a bump at 1.2. That helps it to stay forward and seem bright without being overly bright. I also pull the diffusion right back so that it doesn't become just this perfect wash. Initially I had modulation at 100%, but I noticed it was just starting to get too turgid, so I pulled it back. Fair amount of pre-delay, giving us that sense of, yes, we are in a huge space. So that's our reverb done. All of the construction happens then. The Hornet analog stage, you'll see across everything. Let me just drag this back in. Sometimes I put that in as I'm composing, so it's attached to every instrument as I'm composing. I treat this as though it's, when I did the review on this, as though it's a Neve. It's my mythical Neve. Every time I plug my instrument into the desk, the SSL in this case, or the pretend SSL, then it's got this Hornet. And they all work together. So when I turn this off, everything goes off. So it's a way of turning my desk sound on and off. I love it. It's great. It's appearing on everything at the moment. In terms of mix, then it's how do I get these sounds to work and sound good on their own. There's no right, there's no wrong, but I know certain things are likely to work because I like the way that sounds, therefore it's my style, and also just from having done this before. In many ways, I should use a more aggressive compressor on this, but I don't want to be hearing the compressor as much as just feeling it. And the M class is a nice transparent compressor. You can push it hard, and I am sort of a bit here, but not as much as I was before once I start putting the rhythm bus in. That's just to sort of give a little bit more punch on the front end we got lots of delay. And then it has to work with this bass. So the bass on its own, I'm just starting to do a review for Zebralet, and I always forget how lovely his Zebra sounds. I prefer it to Diva. I'm not really a big fan of Diva. Diva is great, so don't get me wrong, don't get bent out of shape. It just doesn't do it for me, but Zebra I think is a beautiful sounding thing. And I honestly haven't spent much time with Zebralet, but it is cool. I find it a little uncomfortable for my workflow, but it sounds beautiful. We've put these paired together in the mix, and the usual, just let's pull them together. And that gives us this huge sense of punch. It makes that sound massive, and that was always the feeling that a lot of times I want my rhythm sections to sound fairly small. The little bit that I played you off MP3 before, that rhythm section is all actually designed to sound quite small. This wants to feel enormous. In terms of the pulsette, this is using Nova. We've been talking about Nova, and that reminded me of this because one of the problems that I have with this sound, again it's coming off Zebralet, is that it's kind of scratchy here. Actually, I probably should bring in the old F2. In solo, not so much, but you can hear there's just this kind of, it gets a little bit... So it's 3 layers of managing this. Rather than trying to solve it in one place, I go away here and then I go away there. So part of the way initially was to work in wideband and give it a compression. So that's just in the wideband. I then pull out this particular band and work on that alone. Because that's where the pointy bit is. It reduces the amount of compression everywhere else because most of the work is being done here, because most of the signal is here, and it smooths some of the compression. I quite liked the overall compression, but we weren't chasing punch on this one. We were chasing some impact and feel, but it still wanted to feel a little smooth and organic. So this gives us a nice sense of movement in that, and then overall in the mix, pulling this back a little bit, pushing that forward. So it gives a little bit more movement. It's not quite as straight as it was. This just puts some body into it because remember, it's not really a bass sound, but it's a rhythm guitar type sound, even though it sounds nothing like it. A big pad from the beginning. I did go through, as I said, looking to go, okay, well, I can hear resonancy kinds of things. Inevitable because it's made from resonance. And it's like, okay, I'll get rid of that because that's going to be bad. I'll get rid of that because that's going to be bad. And that really is not the Benedict approach. But I sort of felt like, I could hear everybody else in my head. And that's this eternal thing to be pushing us onto the grid of everyone's expectations. Improved it, but the problem was that it sounded gutted. And I'd play it and put it in with this. It's like, what's the point of that sound? It was all about its resonances and its constant doing this. So there was just one point where I sort of felt like, look, I can clarify this a little bit. And that was it. Left it alone. I want this thing to sparkle like nothing on earth. That's the lot of that. It is built out of kind of all these things. It does have a Nova in here as well. kind of doing the same thing because of its activity. So a lot of the resonance is being quelled here. You can see a lot of it sits here. There's a wideband compression and then that sparkly thing on top. So it really didn't need anything here at all. This one at 500 just helps to clarify a little bit, which is good because it needs to be a clear sorbet kind of a sound. The maxi lead. Very soft on the way that I've handled this. I've chosen this in reality to actually be the lead. It's the first point where the piece stops being sort of mechanical or repetitive. So therefore, it needs to be our lead. Now, there's lots of sparkle in that first sound, the fly pad, so much sparkle, and we can make it prettier with more up on top, boosting it up here. But the problem is it just dominates everything, and it's not the lead. It's a pattern, and then we've got this that comes in as lead. So the solution is to go quite the opposite in how it's processed, which is that we've got the things that make our sound, and then just to bring it brighter. Hear how that sort of gets a bit lost? The difference is very subtle. You're going to just feel it more than hear it. But by lifting the air a bit, 4 dB, it's plenty, and then just with the wide bell, moving this out of the way a little bit. I've gone sort of fairly low, but it's more just the shape here to clarify and put a little bit more of the energy and the feel up here. And that allows that sound to rise through and therefore slightly above the tinkle, tinkle, tinkle of the fly pad. So even though it's still kind of down in the mix, it manages to just sort of pull itself up over the edge. Then we've got fullness, which comes in later. That's here. Huge amount of layers in this thing. That's the bright bit. There's some noise. You don't hear this as much up there, but we've got that little tinkly tinkly thing. This is where you really hear the noise, so it creates this human voice feel. I left the treble alone. I figured that was nicely enough handled here. I liked the sound of it. Just pulled back a little bit here because we don't want that to dominate too much, especially where it's in the bright. It sounds a little flat, but by changing our curve ever so slightly, it sounds a lot less flat and samey. And then as we get into here, I boosted that mid and pulled its treble a little bit. So that's the same exact thing that I commonly use to make bass seem bassier, which is to cut the fundamental a little bit and boost its first harmonic. And that gives us this really nice feeling of a huge round bass, whilst actually technically having less bass to mess up our mix and our balance. So it gives it more of that sort of throat and body kind of feel. So it really emphasizes this. I've changed level a little bit, so that's about 3 dB down when it comes in just as a high string, and then brought it up to full volume as we've got this sort of throaty bit. And then it starts to fade out towards the end. Because its job is done. It's still important in the mix, but its job is increasingly done. We're sort of going to move that out of the way. And that's our piece. So notice how every decision is far more about how do I help tell the story than about what's the right thing to do. And where I tried to, or where I started to fall for the thou shalt, because I see and hear all of these YouTube videos about, and I try not to watch too many of them. Sometimes I watch them for other reasons, and sometimes I think I get sucked into watching them for wrong reasons. The thing is, I really work to say what's the story here. What are the song gods? What's this thing outside of myself? The song itself trying to say and do. So when it comes to the mixing point, it's always about how do I do that, and making sure that I stay with that, because in the end, the idea of mixing is not about making my piece perfect. It's about bringing out the story. And when you get a mix that helps the story shine, then we can say it's perfect. Some of the best mixing that I know of is when I listen to records and I'm not thinking about mixing. If I'm listening to records and I'm thinking about how they mixed it, then I'm thinking the mixing and maybe the record itself isn't that great. Therefore, I start to have issues. So a lot of the time when I'm listening to indie stuff, here, listen to my thing, give me likes and plays. Piss off. It's obviously not about the story. It's about your ego, you poor individual. But what I start to hear very, very fast is mixing. I started listening to something somebody was asking for feedback on, but then they had locked off every way of actually answering their question. It's really bright. And the problem was that while the music was quite nice, it really was, in his mixing phase, he'd done nothing but think about mixing. And that meant that as I'm listening, I'm just hearing mixing and this really flat music. Not because the music itself necessarily sucked, but because his mixing was nothing to do with how do I tell the story. I'm guessing he probably tried to sell some sort of story when he was doing the music bit, but when he got to the mixing phase, that all went out the window, and it just sounded thin and flat and papery, and I couldn't really tell what the story was about because all I could hear was his mixing. And he knew there was something wrong with that because he was asking for people to help him understand how to make it better. And that's sad, because when he puts it out, he'll get a couple of likes and pats on the head for being clever so people can prove how socially responsible they are in putting likes and head pats on his post. But that's it. It's going to finish at that point. Nobody's going to listen to the record again because all they're hearing is technique. And sadly, not good technique at that, because good technique is not about being, how fast can I play notes? That's losing. Great technique is about how can I tell a story? How can I move my audience, or at least that part of the audience that want to be moved, or moved in the way that this song wants to move them. Playing Titanic to an audience who've come to watch slasher movies probably don't have a lot of people being moved. And vice versa. You get an audience in to watch a double header of Beaches and Titanic and start playing them slasher movies. The only move you're going to see is out the door. But that's nothing to do with whether any of those movies are good or bad. It's simply because they're the wrong audience. But if the movie is well done, then you've got a greater chance of actually getting people to go, yeah, it may not have been what I came here for, but you know what, that's good. That's how I saw Far and Away, a Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman movie. I really enjoyed that movie. I went in with no expectation and really enjoyed that movie because it was just really enjoyable. Same with Captain Corelli's mandolin. Tap, 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 tap. It was actually a lovely movie when I went in with no expectations. Later, when I watched it with high expectations from the joy that I had the first time I saw it, it was like, maybe it wasn't as great. But you know what? Going with no expectations, it was a lovely movie. You hope to have an audience who have no expectations. The problem with this grid, that has to be in tune, has to be in time, has to be the formula, that's the real damage, is that the audiences increasingly have such high expectations, they're so rigid. That's hard to change other than to show them something completely outside of that. And that's the way that I always work, because we can't play the same game as people who've got massive budgets behind them to advertise and say, come watch your Titanic movie, come watch your slasher movie. We've just got to kind of surprise people and have them go, oh, that was interesting, I need to take that ride again. Still a complex subject, but I hope you can sort of gradually understand that we have been brought into an environment which tells us that to succeed, we have to glom onto this grid concept of has to be in tune, has to be in time, has to be this key, has to be this formula. I mean, this key, side trance, only allows you to use one key, often only one note. If you use a wrong note, you can get a bollocking. I know, because I did. I played around with some elements of psytrance and dared suggest that in a forum and actually got a bollocking for you've got it wrong, you've used the wrong note. How can somebody say what note I should use? I should use whatever note the song needs. And to say that the song can only be on, I think it was F sharp or something or other, it's a big sort of to you. So it is a hard environment, but to be able to step outside of that, we have to play David to the machine's Goliath. The industry, everything that I'm encapsulating here as the grid, we have to be the opposite of that, which is to step us outside of that. Yes, we may use some elements of that to, I guess, do the things that we enjoy, and also to maybe provide a little bit of crossover. But the moment we've crossed too far over into the grid, then we can't create something outside of that to be a tremendous surprise for a true listening audience. Remember, a true listening audience is not actually other musicians. Most of the time, all they want to do these days, especially the losers hanging around in groups and forums, yes, I know I'm posting this in my own group and forum, is that they're there to actually express their fear of being off-grid by telling everyone else they're off-grid. They're not going to be your fan. They're never going to be your fan. Find the randoms who are wandering around, who encounter something and go, ooh, be still my beating little heart, and want to get into what you do. And that means you have to be outside of that perfect grid. So find your stories. They can be about anything. They can be pretty vague and pretty diffuse. They can be about throwing shapes on the big beat floor, if that's what your thing is. But make it exceptional. Where new music, new forms have come in there, it is because people have stepped outside of the ordinary. Disco stepped outside of the ordinary, then disco became ordinary. New wave borrowed from disco and then did things outside of the ordinary. New Order's Blue Monday, very outside the ordinary. There's nothing like that track. There's a ton of stuff that came through then that was outside of the ordinary, was really very amazing. And the same happened with metal. The same happened with rock, with grunge. But then it became so ordinary and the grid became far too dominant that everything had to be exactly so. And then the whole thing became boring as well, something very boring. Focus on how can I be outside of that? How can I give somebody a real pleasant surprise? Not by doing something kooky or stupid, but by being so warm, so engaged in the way I tell my story. Which is why if I'm going to listen to EBM, I would far rather listen to an old Front 242 record than a new whoever whatever. But when I encountered And One, I was like, oh, that's rather cool. And I bought one of their records, and I still like that record because there are things about it that are very musical. The songs are interesting. I don't think it's as dramatic as, say, like early Front 242, but it works well enough to justify its place in the sun, or the stop sign, as the case may be for that record. So, strange concept, but trust the song gods. Don't trust the grid. The grid is your enemy here. Everything that says be on the grid, be on the grid, be on the grid, be on the grid, no, get away from that. Trust the song gods. Listen to that idea of where the song talks to you, which you've heard me talk about here. It's like, well, I was playing with the sand, and then it just kind of, the sand gave me this line, which was three notes, but the sound gave me that. Even though I was working in a different key, it gave me the form, and then from there I was able to work out how to put it together. That's my job, to work out how to express it. But by listening to the song rather than the formula, it showed me what was needed, and this came together really quite quickly, and I'm pretty darn delighted with it, I will say. If you have any questions, you can pop them on down below in the video, or, and this is really designed to go in my Indie Musicians Guidebook group. If you're already a member, great, you can ask your questions there on this. If not, then please have a look at how the group works, read the about, read the rules, and sign on up, and we will take it from there. You have a great day.